In order to describe the transformations that we see in a composition of transformations, it's probably important to figure out where our pre-image is, where our first image is, and where our second image is. So looking at this first example, I know that my pre-image is this blue triangle, and I know that because there are no primes, there's no apostrophes on the labels. So that must be where I start. Using then primes as the indication, the single prime, the red triangle, is going to be my first image. So that's going to be the first rule I need to figure out. And then the double prime is going to be my second image. So that's going to be the order that I need to write these rules in. So first up, let's figure out what's going on from the pre-image into our first image. And so I have three options at this point. I can do a translation, a rotation, or a reflection, a slide, a flip, or a spin. I can see that to go from my pre-image to the first image, that's going to be a translation. All I did was slide the triangle to get it to line up. So I'm going to say for rule 1, I have a translation. However, I want to be a little more specific and actually say what that translation is. So you may recall writing rules for translations before. We kind of wrote them in this format. We didn't just say up 7 or left 3. We wrote them more mathematically. And so first up, let's go ahead and figure out how many units to the right or left I've slid. So in this case, let's just get the A's to line up. I can see that I must be sliding to the right in this case, so I'm adding something. And counting up my spaces, I can see that I'm moving to the right 5 spaces. So for my first part of my rule, I'm going to say x plus 5, comma. I also want to figure out the vertical slide I did, and I can see that, again, to get the A's to line up, I must have moved up 1. That's the y direction, so I'm going to do y plus 1. So there's my first rule figured out to get from my pre-image to the first image. Well, next up, I got to figure out what to do to get from the first image to the second one. I can see this time it's not a simple slide because the triangle's upside down, so translation is out. The two options then that are left are either to do a rotation or a reflection. This is sometimes hard for people to figure out which one's which, so maybe try this. To test if it's a rotation, sort of put your pencil at the origin of that graph right there in the middle and spin your paper around. If you can spin it so it looks like the original, then you know you've found it's a rotation. If you imagine putting a mirror down and flipping it, then you'd have a reflection. So it's a little bit hard to figure out, but in this case it does work out to be a rotation. I have spun the triangle to get it to line up with the second image. But once again, I don't want to just say rotation, I want to say how far I've spun it. There's 3 options. If I spin it a quarter turn, which is basically a quadrant, think of that as rotating 90 degrees. If I've spun halfway around, which would be 2 quadrants, that's 180 degrees. And if I spin 3/4 around, that's going to be your 270. So I can see that to get from this first image to the second image, I've done a half turn. I've spun my paper 180 degrees, so I would say that I have a rotation of 180. Okay, at this point, if you want to try this second one on your own, that would be a great thing to try. Otherwise, you can kind of let the video play through and my answers will pop up and we'll kind of talk about them briefly. Hopefully the first thing you did was start out as I did. Oops, it stopped going there. There we go. Start out like I did. Label the pre-image, the first image, and the second image by looking at the primes. I can see that to go from the pre to the first image, I flipped it. I did not translate it. Obviously, I didn't slide it. I didn't spin it either. I would have to reflect it. And notice I didn't just say that for rule 1, it wasn't just a reflection. I wanted to say what my line of reflection was, and that was the y-axis. Once again, then, to go from the first to the second image, it was another flip. I couldn't slide it. I couldn't spin it. I had to flip it. So rule 2 was also a reflection. And once again, I want to say what the line of reflection is, and this time it was the x-axis.